When Clara inherited her grandmother's house, she also inherited something else, a porcelain doll named Lila. With bright blue glass eyes, golden curls, and a dress as intricately detailed as a wedding gown, Lila was no ordinary doll. Clara remembered playing with it as a child but hadn't seen it in years. Her grandmother, a collector of oddities, had kept it locked in a glass cabinet, claiming it was special. Moving into the creaky old house felt more like a duty than a blessing. Clara had no choice. Her life in the city had fallen apart, and the solitude of her grandmother's home seemed a necessary retreat. The doll, now sitting on her bedroom dresser, was one of the first things Clara unpacked, not because she loved it, but because it seemed to belong there, as though the house wouldn't be complete without it. On her first night, Clara heard faint noises, scratching like tiny nails on wood. She chalked it up to the old house settling and went to bed, too tired to investigate. The next morning, Lila was not on the dresser. She was sitting on the windowsill, her head tilted toward the glass as if gazing outside. Clara frowned. "Must have knocked you over last night," she muttered, placing the doll back on the dresser, but an unease settled in her chest. That night, the scratching returned. Louder this time. It seemed to come from inside the walls. Clara tossed and turned until a thud jolted her awake. Sitting bolt upright, she scanned the room. Lila was on the floor, halfway between the dresser and the bed. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She picked up the doll and placed it back on the dresser with shaking hands. The third night was worse. Clara woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like a child murmuring a song just out of earshot. The hair on her neck stood on end. Her eyes darted to the dresser. Lila was gone. Panicking, Clara grabbed her phone for light and scanned the room. The doll was at the foot of her bed, sitting upright, its blue eyes fixed on her. "No," Clara breathed. "No, no." She locked the doll in the closet that night, stuffing it into a box and barricading the door with a chair. Still she hardly slept, listening for the sound of tiny hands against the wood. By morning, Clara convinced herself she was imagining things. She decided to get rid of Lila. Wrapping the doll in an old blanket, she drove to the edge of the woods and tossed it into a dumpster. Relieved, she returned home, the sense of dread easing as she went about her day. That night, she allowed herself to relax, sinking into the worn leather armchair in the living room. A soft tap, tap, tap echoed from the hallway. Clara froze. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. It was coming closer. She turned her head slowly toward the sound. There, in the dim light of the hallway, stood Lila. The doll's blue eyes glinted, and her porcelain mouth was no longer frozen in a painted smile. It had widened into something far more sinister. Clara screamed, stumbling back as the doll took a step forward. Its movements were jerky but purposeful, as though something unseen was pulling the strings. "You shouldn't have left me," a voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the doll, but from everywhere at once. Clara ran, her breath hitching, her heart pounding like a drum. She grabbed her car keys and fled the house. She didn't return for weeks, staying with friends in the city and leaving the house empty. When she finally mustered the courage to go back, she found the house exactly as she'd left it, except for the doll. Lila was gone. Clara tried to convince herself that someone had broken in and taken it. Maybe a neighbor, a thief, or even a kid who'd found it lying around. But deep down, she knew the truth. The scratching at her apartment door that night confirmed it.